combobulated already as we ever are.
All right, we're good.
Okay, in that case, let's talk to God and we'll get rolling. Father, thank you for this opportunity to be together, both those who are here in front of us in the room together, as well as those who joined us by way of WebEx on the monitor, and those who will join us later. We're grateful for this time. We pray that we make the most of the time, and that our communication would be clear, and the topics we pursue would, in fact, be not only productive, but positive as well in contributing to our lives. Thank you. Let's be sure.
All right.
Okay. Well, then we're going to start the way our usual format is set up to start, and that is those of you who are here in the room with us get first crack at any questions that you may have that have been circulating in your minds and pop into your mind suddenly. And just to let you know, this may very well be a first. If not a first, it's a second. We have received no pre-questions on email.
I know. It's okay, though. It's all right. We have things that we always have things that we can share.
Okay, so any questions from the three of you that pop into mind?
I got to get to work studying again to ask questions.
Really, you don't have to study.
Well, thank you for it. All right, so then, to the second audience, we asked those of you who've been able to join us by way of WebEx, do you have any questions that have been popping into and out of your minds recently, or even more anciently, if I might use that term? You mean we've answered all those questions you've had down through the months and the weeks? Skylar, did you just raise your hand?
I've actually got like two, but I'll go with the shorter, potentially easier one first.
Okay.
What is the yeah, I had it written down. What is the branch in Ezekiel 8:17 where it says that God is talking about them holding the branch to their nose? And I think the context is like idolatrous worship and stuff. My mom, I was like, I have always been curious about this. I love Ezekiel. Ask the rabbi that you know. They'll probably know.
Ezekiel what?
8:17 is the specific verse, but
All right.
surrounding verses for context, of course.
I just happen to have an interlinear Hebrew Bible here. Because we were looking at other
For
stuff.
other stuff, yeah.
8 what?
You said 8:17.
17, yes. And he said to me, you see, son of man, that the detestable things that you do, that Judah does, or for the house of Judah, is it trivial? And must they continue? All right, 8:17. Here's what I have for 8:17. He said to me, have you seen this, son of man? Is it a trivial matter for the house of Judah to do the detestable things they are doing here? Must they also fill the land with violence and continually provoke me to anger? Look at them putting the branch to their nose. Oh, there it is. Okay. Yeah. El Afim. Afam.
Okay.
El Afam. Right now, I don't have any clue, but I'm
All right.
guessing it's a pagan practice.
Yes, that would be, in that context, that would be the general assumption you would make, that it would be some sort of pagan practice they had fallen into and that they should not be involved in. Please remember that Ezekiel, when he is writing as part of the second group of people that were taking the captivity into Babylon. First group were the higher ups, went in 606 and 607. Then there was a group that went in 597. Well, Ezekiel's part of the 597 group. So there's a possibility then that he is referencing some sort of pagan practice that was current around them, not only in Babylon, but also perhaps referencing something back.
No, it's referencing something back because at the beginning
That's what I
of
was going to
chapter
next.
8,
Okay.
it says he was minding his own business, Ezekiel was, in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day, while I was sitting in my house, And the elders of Judah were sitting before
Before he
me.
got taken
The
captive.
hand of, no, this is while he's in captivity.
Oh, okay.
He's sitting in front of the elders,
Thank
the
you.
Jewish elders, and the hand of the sovereign Lord came upon me there. I looked and I saw a figure like that of a man from what he appeared. So this man took him on a tour. So on this tour that Ezekiel is getting, sort of like drone coverage of the latest war that we would experience on television, he's being taken to see what's going on in and around the temple. And what this angelic being is showing him is not good. Now, to me, the minute you say something about a tree, that reminds me that you have the two most popular gods. I'm not going to say they're the main gods. Most popular gods are Baal and Ashtart. And the way that common ordinary people would worship Ashtart would be they would put her shrine, for lack of a better term, under a giant tree. And if the tree was on a hill, it would be even better than that. And so trees were intermixed with worship of Ashtart, who's a woman who's the consort of Baal. So this is something along the lines of, oh, I love to sniff these branches because the smell of them reminds me of Ashtart and how wonderful she is and how she takes care of us, especially with the rain and the war thing. Because if we're nice to her, she's going to be nice to Baal, and we need thunder, lightning, and rain from Baal, and we need war ability to go to war from Baal, because there are two go-to people or gods when we need to do all those things. So so it says to me that even the worship of Ashtarte, it has now gone and permeated the temple, which is what we're told is happening when he's taken on this tour by this angelic being. It's like the last straw. I think by the time he gets there and sees that, they're sniffing the branches of Ashtarte's tree in the temple. It's like the last straw. It's like, oh, I cannot see anymore, kind of thing.
Jacob shared something with me that
From his phone, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's associated the same way, but if I remember correctly, it was supposed to be some sort of show of humility. Is that what?
To a foreign deity.
Humility
To a foreign deity
Okay.
in the temple. Yeah.
Now, if you think about the historical context, as I said earlier, Ezekiel left or was taken in 597 in the second group of people to be taken. So the people of Judah would have seen two groups already taken. They might have been in, no, not they might have been, they would have been in great despair. And they might then have thought, well, our God has failed us, so we're going to look elsewhere for some sort of deity. So you could understand why this was taking place. Ezekiel is, well, you teach about Ezekiel, but Ezekiel was often taken back in these kinds of visions that the tree shared to all kinds of places. In the Bible I have, it has a very interesting note that I smiled at. It says a ceremonial gesture in nature worship, okay, fair enough, not documented elsewhere in the Bible.
But you can.
So
yeah.
in other words, they're doing the same thing we're trying to do, is to come up with a connection. And this is the only time it occurs in the Bible. So
Yeah, but if you
it's
know,
that connection.
if you know the bottom line is
Yeah.
that Ashtart, and when you talk about you gather under the trees to worship this pagan god, that's Ashtart. And because there's several references throughout the prophets about you gather on the hills under the green tree and you proceed to worship somebody else other than God. I do want to point out that to me, one of the most solemn and really, it's a terrible passage, but everybody should be familiar with it. Starting in verse 9, so that's like 20 words after the sniffing the branches. It sounds dirty in a certain way, doesn't it? All right, chapter 9. Then I heard him, so the angelic being that's escorting me around the temple, Bring the guards of the city here, each with a weapon in his hand. And I saw 6 men coming from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north. He is in the temple when he's seeing these things in chapter 8. Ezekiel is there, or he's being shown it like we would be shown it on a close-up on TV. So it's just like he was there, because I don't know if you've ever felt like you see things on TV and you think, I feel like I'm there. Well, this would be double for Ezekiel. So whether or not his 3D body is actually in Jerusalem sort of doesn't matter. It's how far you want to take that concept of how is Ezekiel seeing this? Is he there physically, or is it being just shown on him in a big Cinerama movie in his mind? Discuss, but we're not going to discuss it now. And what you're going to see from this point on in chapter 9 is the Shekinah is now going to leave the temple. Jenny's nodding. The Shekinah is going to leave the temple. If you think this is a big, fat moment in history, oh, it is. And it's not a pleasant moment in history by any means. It's like one of the top 5 most impressive things that happens. And by impressive, I don't mean, oh, goody, wow. I mean like, oh, no, the worst. The glory of God of Israel, and there we are. He's standing right next to, or he is right next to the bronze altar or the brazen altar, if you're reading King James. The glory of God of Israel went up from above the cherubim, in other words, from the throne. And Ezekiel can see in some way the Shekinah lifting up from the throne. Where had it been, and moved to the threshold of the temple. It's leaving the Holy of Holies, and it's going to continue to leave until we get to chapter 11. Then the Lord called to the man clothed in linen that we've seen before, but we didn't read it, who had the writing kit at his side, and said to him, go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it. So if you want to talk about end times, this is the original place where you have a mark placed on those who are going to survive. Oops, I just gave away part of the plot. 9 verse 5, as I listened, he said to the others, follow him through the city and kill, without showing pity or compassion. Slaughter the old men, young men, and maidens, women and children, but do not touch anyone who has the mark. So if you're reading about end time stuff and you're not including this story, I think you're leaving out a big fat problem area that you need to cover. Then it says, begin at my sanctuary. Let the killing begin at my sanctuary. So the picture is, here is the judgment of God. He's leaving the temple. One presumes he's going to join his people in exile. But the point also is that the people who are in and around the temple are the first to get judged, not the last. And that applies to other passages in the newer covenant, where it's time to begin the judgment of God, and the household of faith is going to go first, not last. So everyone, I want to say everyone should butch up and be brave, because it's not like we get to sit around in a chaise lounge and watch everybody else get judged. No, we're the first to be judged. So a lot of things about that are in the actual scriptures and not out of some teachers and preachers and charlatans' mouths about end times don't cover this. And yet it's clearly here, and yet the New Testament writers know this. They know this passage, even though we might not. I don't want to read the whole entire thing. Then he sent to them, this is the guard that's going with Elijah. I'm sorry, Ezekiel, defile the temple and fill the courts with the slain. So they went out and began killing throughout the city. While they were killing and I was left alone, I fell down. I fell face down, crying out, "Oh, sovereign Lord, are you going to destroy the entire remnant of Israel in this outpouring of your wrath on Jerusalem?" He answered me, "The sin of the house of Israel and Judah." So this is both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. It's not just the northern kingdom, who's already had a pretty good judgment. "Israel and Judah is exceedingly great. The land is full of bloodshed, and the city is full of injustice. They say," meaning the people who are in Jerusalem, "the Lord has forsaken the land. The Lord does not see." So now I'm in 9, verse 10. "So I will not look on them with pity or spare them, but I will bring down on their own heads what they have done." Then the man in linen brought the writing kit at the writing kit at his side, brought back word saying, "I have done as you commanded." And then in chapter 10, I won't take the time to read it, but you should. You see the Shekinah, the visible glory of God, get up and leave the temple. And where is he going? Well, he goes out the eastern gate. He goes out the eastern gate, the gate that faces Babylon. And the last time they see him, I'm in 10:18. "Then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim." This is now, he's not in the Holy of Holies. He's outside in the getting ready to leave the temple. "While I watched, the cherubim spread their wings and rose from the ground. And as they went the wheels, he sees a cart, the magical dune buggy, as our professor used to call it, that can roll here and there. That Elijah saw and was taken on. The wheels went with them. They stopped at the entrance to the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the Lord was among them. These were the living creatures I had seen beneath the God of Israel by the Kavar River, and I realized they were cheruvim in Hebrew. Cheruvim, the translators out of Hebrew into other languages did not even bother to change their Hebrew name, which is cheruvim. And it's just that we pronounce it with our really bad English accents, the cherubim. They didn't even bother to change it to another language. It's interesting, isn't it? Does that sort of answer your question? I over-answered your question,
No,
Skylar.
Gave a
Context.
context.
Skylar, you have not been in my classes lately, but let me tell you, one of my most recent, I've known this for years, but recently I've been able to use it many, many times. A text, like a biblical passage, without a context, what on earth is going on when this text is going on, is a pretext. And a pretext, if you look it up in the dictionary, is a lie. So just sniffing the branches without the context of why on earth is that happening, and who cares anyway if they're sniffing branches. And then when you connect it with one of the most horrible moments human beings experienced on earth, I would say. Okay, I hope that answered your question about sniff. Don't sniff branches. I don't recommend it.
So basically,
Except if it's a lilac, then I sniff all the branches I can because I love lilac.
so Patrice, basically what you're saying is this is more like an idiom then, right?
No, I think they actually probably are sniffing the branches, but they're doing something that's totally heinous.
Right. Okay. But it's associated with something that's heinous, like you said.
Yes, it's
Okay.
associated with pagan worship inside the temple. Yeah, that's pretty. I would say that'd be in the top 5 of most heinous things you can do. Just my opinion. Okay, you get to answer the next question.
It depends what it is.
Yeah, okay.
And Skylar, you thought that was an easy question, right?
Well, it was, except for the context.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
like that's the
Paul
last.
joined the live stream on YouTube and told me to say thank you. because it was her question.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear it.
Sorry, my mom joined the live stream on YouTube and texted me to say thank you because that was her question.
Okay. So I gave her too much answer, so that's good.
Yeah, she likes Ezekiel. That's one of her favorite books. So
Yeah.
that's good. My second question. Hold on.
Oh, I didn't bring my water today and I need it, so I might go get it. I'll get it. Okay, sit there. You answer the question.
Well, it depends what it is. Oh, I see. Somebody has joined
Oh,
us.
hi. Does he have a question?
Yes. So my second question, just from a variety of different things I've thought of, is what roles or positions would Gentiles play within the Messianic congregation, particularly in the context of like leadership? So like with rabbi, pastor, elder, would it be possible for a Gentile to hold that position? I know, like in most non-Messianic forms of Judaism, my understanding is that would be like a no. But what about as believers in Yeshua? Does that change things? I don't see being Jewish a requirement like Timothy and Titus. So does that mean in a synagogue anybody could be a rabbi, or would there need to be like separate non-synagogue congregations for Gentiles to be like the elder pastor position, or is a rabbi, elder, pastor like totally different things? And the question is way off base.
Okay, good luck with that.
Well, no, I was going to bounce it right back at you because of the whole God-fearers issue.
Get started.
Okay. There are various, you were right in that this is a many layered issue, and one which has been discussed back and forth in the Messianic movement for the many decades the modern form of the Messianic movement has in fact taken place, or has reemerged. First of all, in the larger context, if you hear in the broader world around us, if you hear the word rabbi being used of someone, what do you think of? Or whom do you think of?
I would say pastor. The Jewish.
Okay. So,
She said a Jewish pastor.
okay. So in other words, the leader of a synagogue or
the common.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, the leader of a synagogue, and as you said yourself, you normally assume that leader to be Jewish. So in the wider Jewish world, it is assumed that if you use the term rabbi, that you're referring to a Jewish person. Now, in the history of the modern Messianic movement, a lot of people have taken on that title of rabbi. Whether or not they've been ordained was not an issue. That was not part of the discussion frequently, and I'll get to that part of it in a moment. But any leader of any congregation, if it was a Messianic congregation, frequently the leader would either take it on for himself or it would be applied to him by the congregation. That in itself is problematic for two reasons. Number one, if the person wasn't Jewish, the normal assumption of who a rabbi is that that person is Jewish. Second, if that person wasn't properly ordained, we call it smicha, then technically in the wider Jewish community, that person doesn't qualify as a rabbi, regardless of how he or she may function within in the congregation or in the synagogue. Okay. Now, just to bring in another aside here, because as I said, Skylar, this is many layered and leveled. We even had this conversation at the most recent Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations conference. Do we ordain women as rabbis? Now, the wider Jewish world, the resounding answer to that is yes. And in fact, since the 1930s, parts of the wider Jewish world were ordaining women as rabbis. We happened to discover this one of our trips to Berlin. We happened to go past the synagogue where the first Reform woman rabbi was ordained as rabbi in the 1930s. In Berlin. Certainly for at least 50 years, women have been ordained not only in Reform Judaism, but also in conservative Judaism.
In the past 8 to 10 years. Within Orthodox Judaism, you have a level of leadership now formally recognized by many parts of Orthodox Judaism. I forget what they're called,
I'm trying to
though.
remember.
They have a special name
It's
for
a
them.
female form of,
And it's not the wife of a rabbi.
no,
It can be just her being in this leadership position.
like Rabina.
Something like Rabbina, but
Yeah.
we're not sure. Don't
Okay.
quote us on it.
Just to be very, very clear, and I'm going to say this so Patrice doesn't go off on an aside on this. They are not, women rabbis are not called rebbitzins.
Please do not call a woman rabbi or the wife of your rabbi rebbitzin. It's not a happy, nice term in real life.
In a lot of Jewish contexts. It
Yeah.
has certain connotations that are not positive connotations.
Yeah, just call her whatever her name is.
Yeah. So, that's the whole concept of rabbi. I will say this, even though this is,
No, I was going to say, because you can be a rabbi without leading a congregation.
very good.
Correct.
Right?
Absolutely.
It's totally different concepts.
Yes,
Yes.
very, very good point.
Maybe you want to tell me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, our conversation has been those who function as rabbis within congregations. And that applies to both men and women, as Patrice was saying, even bringing in the Orthodox community. But as Jacob pointed out from the audience, many rabbis function outside of synagogues or congregations, simply
Or tangentially.
or simply operating as teachers within the broader Jewish movement.
Or scholar.
Or scholars, yes. One of our favorites, I don't know if he's ever had a pulpit, he may have, was Rabbi Dr. Daniel Cohen Sherbach. He's a favorite because he was a major scholar in Reform Judaism, taught at the University of Wales,
Yes,
right? Am I correct in that?
yes.
And he wrote a book called, I think it's called Messianic Judaism,
Yes.
in which he defended what he called the branch of Judaism called Messianic Judaism as a viable and vital branch of Judaism. He's saying this as a non-Messianic Jew. And now you can understand why he's one of our favorites.
Okay. You're saying was like he's dead now.
No, he's not dead now.
Okay. So he's still alive as far as
But he is retired.
he's retired, but doesn't mean you're dead.
No.
Thank you.
I had the opportunity to work personally with him on a couple of projects. Patrice and I were invited to contribute chapters to a book that he edited on Messianic Judaism called Voices of Messianic Judaism, which I think might actually be on the table here.
Available here at the synagogue for, I don't know, a mere pittance.
So anyhow, he is a perfect example of a person who's considered rabbi, but who did not have a congregation for many years. I don't know if he ever had one. So thank you for that important reminder.
And then you can be a leader of congregation without being a rabbi.
That's right.
Correct.
And you can be a leader of a congregation without being a rabbi. And in fact, a number of congregations only have a president or some other functionary because they're in an area where there aren't as many Jewish people, and they often are then served by a rabbi who is
An
an
itinerant
itinerant
rabbi.
rabbi who goes from temple to synagogue to congregation to serve them all in some fashion. Okay, now, that's all in the general context of what a rabbi is. Is a rabbi an elder? Is a rabbi a pastor? Is a rabbi whatever else? The term rabbi itself ultimately means teacher, and it became known in the history of Judaism, and therefore, as part of its function, as what has been called a decisor. In other words, someone who is involved in deciding questions, in issuing judgments in the very broad, narrow sense. That's another important role of rabbi. And in fact, when we ordain rabbis within the Messianic Jewish Rabbinic Council, one of the things we point out in that smikah or ordination process is that this person is now qualified to be not just a teacher in a congregation, but a decisor or decider within the larger community. And of the rabbis that we have ordained in the MJRC. There is a prominent one who does not have a congregation. Actually, there's a second prominent one, although her husband's the rabbi of their synagogue. She was ordained before he was, but she serves basically as a halakhic decisor or as a teacher, but does not serve as the leader of that. She doesn't serve as the leader of her own particular synagogue. Her husband does. And again, I will say, just so no misunderstanding here, she was ordained before her husband was ordained. Okay. So he didn't take over the synagogue because it was finally a male rabbi. That was not what happened. But anyhow, because there's a lot of that going on with, particularly within Messianic Jewish circles, for whom the issue of a woman being a rabbi remains an issue, even though, as we've already talked about it, other forms of Judaism have gone beyond that.
The word decisor is not in an English dictionary. Are you sure that's the word?
That's the technical word, and that's why I put it to decider. I'm not sure.
Decisor is not in my
No.
handy dandy dictionary that cover, it's a Spanish word.
Interesting.
That's just me and I looked it up in my dictionary on my phone. Okay, but what he's asking though is,
Again, we hadn't got to that.
is if I, let's say, if I as a Gentile go to a Messianic synagogue, should I give up any hope of ever being in any kind of leadership at the Messianic synagogue? And that kind of, I
Yeah.
heard that first, those questions first.
And I was going to move there, but I want to take an intervening step.
Oh, go ahead.
Within the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, who has been ordaining rabbis for 40 years? No,
No,
45 to 50 years, actually.
at the very beginning, they didn't. Who did they ordain at the beginning of the union?
David Friedman, myself.
No, but that was after they set up guidelines.
Yes, that was after.
That's
Yeah,
what
yeah,
I mean.
no,
That
no,
didn't happen in 1975.
No, not in 75, but it happened in the late 70s, in 78 or 79.
Okay, but that was after we spent 3 years arguing with each other about how
Yeah,
Messianic synagogues were going to work and who was going to be in charge and how could we be in charge of knuckleheads who were going to set up their own little party with their own synagogue? Because that still happens, actually.
yeah, it does. But my point that I was developing is earlier on, the union did ordain Gentiles who went through the education process, who completed the education process. And that's what Patrice was talking about. A whole education process was set up that you had to complete in order to be ordained as a rabbi, first by the union, and the same kind of thing by the Messianic Jewish Rabbinic Council a little later. A number of years afterwards, this question you raised came up. Should we be, even though they've been trained, should we be calling non-Jewish people rabbis? And the union's decision was, we will no longer ordain them as rabbis. We will ordain them as congregational leaders if they have, in fact, gone through the requirements. So the requirements are the same, both for a Jew or a Gentile, but you are called a congregational leader when you're ordained in the union. If you're not a Jew, if you're a Jew, you're called a rabbi. Now, there was the further proviso, if your congregation calls you rabbi, then who are we to say they can't? And there's a reason for that, because the union is not a denomination, it's an association of congregations. So the union doesn't have that privilege. Okay, so that's the history. Now, that hasn't gotten to the question is, should, and what should be the roles of Gentiles within Messianic Jewish congregations?
I still think you're skipping too much.
Okay.
I just want to make everybody aware that to walk into some place that's calling it, some meeting that's calling itself a Messianic Jewish congregation, first, it might not be anything like a Messianic Jewish congregation because they're doing their own thing, or they're a member of a group that does their own thing, and they really don't care if anybody considers them kosher. They don't care. So I will also say, though, that in the union, and this was brought home to me when we were just all together with the leadership in July, that there are some congregations well-known congregations who really don't want any Gentiles serving on any boards, much less any women. And that our congregation and where we came down on this is somewhat unusual. And so everybody should know that. So you'll have congregations where they think, no, it's not okay for non-Jews to be in any leadership capacity. And you'll see other congregations where, like ours, we more or less put that consideration aside and we look more at what do you do in your life that's Jewish? Realizing that DNA, this is our DNA does not solve the Jewish problem. Just because you have DNA, if you have DNA and don't do one single thing that's Jewish except eat bagels, you still shouldn't be in leadership in a Messianic Jewish congregation. So that makes sense to everybody. But we have known people who have said, if you're Jewish, they'll just take you, and if you're not Jewish, they won't take you, no matter what your upbringing was or what you do in your everyday life. Is that fair enough to say?
Fair enough. That's,
See, he agreed with me, so I didn't overstate at that time.
there's a wide spectrum on this issue throughout the broader Messianic Jewish movement. I almost got off on a tangent, so I just now reined myself in, so I won't go off on that tangent. To stick to the main issue here, let me build a little further on where we stand as a synagogue. Within our particular synagogue, from the outset, one, we've always had women in leadership. Two, we've always had people who are committed to the synagogue and to who we are as a synagogue in leadership, whether they're Jews or Gentiles. But you'll notice what I said, those who are committed to who we are as a synagogue. That's the qualifier. Second qualification is, do these people qualify within the normal biblical parameters of what a leader should look and sound and feel like? Some of those are mentioned in Timothy and Titus, which you referenced earlier, Skylar. But those are the kinds of things we've always looked for. And we've looked for those kinds of things at the various levels of leadership. We call our levels of leadership. Most synagogues operate with a president and then some leaders around them, in addition to a rabbi.
So would they be like the heads of the committees would be around the president, would be in charge of the committees?
Yes.
Gotcha.
But the president would be the person, the guy or the gal who's elected as leader of the synagogue.
And it's absolutely fine, even if they don't want women rabbis. Evidently, it's fine to have a woman who's the president of the congregation.
For some of these congregations.
Oh, I think that's pretty broad.
Yeah, no, it is broad. What I'm saying is that for most of the synagogues that have women as presidents, they wouldn't have a problem with women as rabbis. I'm not talking messianically.
Okay, you're not talking.
No, I'm talking more broadly than that. Okay, so for us, what we did is we maybe somewhat anachronistically went back to a term that was used when there were 70 who were co-appointed with Moses as elders, Zakenim. It is that concept that formed the basis of the use of that term in the writings of the rabbi, Rav Shaul or Paul, and it's also found, if I remember right, within the remains of several synagogues from the, in this case, the post-temple period, but within the first couple of 3 centuries of this era, you have listings of those who were who were called elder or zaken. So our highest level of leadership within the synagogue has to do with the Council of Zakenim. Okay? And that has always had both men and women on it.
Not because of us, but because of Dr. Bronstein, who asked us to come down and help him found the synagogue. Dr. Bronstein said, we are having women on the leadership council. And we went, great, we don't have any problem with that. But this old guy said, you got to have women on the leadership council. For instance, my wife, and we went, that's fine with us. We're groovy. That's good.
So for us, although the rabbi is the figurehead in one sense, the
He's-
rabbi in our synagogue is not the leader.
Yes, we do not have a Baptist form of government. A Baptist form of government is one guy who's in charge of everything at that congregation. So if come from a Baptist or familiar with Baptists, this is actually called church polity, how your church is governed. We are not Baptistic, although there are congregations within the union that seem to be, it's one guy and he picks the elders and he puts everyone in charge or takes away their right to be in charge, and everything comes from him. And that's not the way I have ever seen anything being done, church or synagogue. So, yeah,
And it's not just within the union,
it's not just within
the broader
union.
Messianic movement.
Yes, whether or not they feel that they're an actual congregation and not just, we're just a group that likes to get together and celebrate, kind of thing. Oh, well, let's not even go
Yeah,
into
but I mean,
that.
that's part of the broader.
Or Hebrew roots groups, which can be like clubs rather than a worship place.
But largely speaking, both the Messianic congregations that are in the union and outside the union, there are many that are in fact led by rabbis in this Baptistic kind of fashion.
One person, one synagogue.
Yeah. Now, we were talking about congregational chadash. So we've always had a board or a council of Zakanim to lead this particular synagogue. I'm called rabbi because I happen to be ordained. No, I'll just leave it at that. But the rest of the council are of equal authority, and we're looking at one of them on our screen. And if you're on the screen, you're seeing her as well. And that's Jenny. Jenny is one of our Zakanim. If you want to know who the rest are, then you need to take a look at the front of our bulletin, and they're all listed there, along with a secondary level of leadership called Shamashim. And these also were functionaries. Shamash was a functionary in the early synagogues of the late Second Temple period. So even while the temple was still standing, synagogues had people they would call a Shamashim, if you have more than one. Now, but in all of Judaism, and even going back to the Second Temple period, we're talking about people who are Jews. We still haven't gotten to the point of where and how the Gentiles fit into this. At our particular synagogue, from the outset, we have always had people who are not Jews, who are Gentiles, as part of our leadership. Why? Because they qualified, because they had the commitments. They had the characteristics described by Rabbi Paul or Rav Shaul. And so we felt that they were appropriate in these levels of leadership.
And also, a whole bunch of them converted to Judaism formally.
Okay, yes, a bunch of them did convert.
Nobody fainted? Okay, that's good.
A bunch of them did convert to Judaism formally. They were not required to do so. Some of them didn't. Why didn't they? Because they weren't required to do so, because it's not a requirement. A conversion to Judaism has to be a calling. And for those groups to do, in fact, and this is an aside, and I'm not going to get stuck on the aside tangent, for those groups to do, in fact, have the process of Messianic groups, have the process of people converting to Judaism. They're very careful about who they allow through that process. These are people who have to have a distinct and clear calling to become a Jew. Not to become part of a Messianic synagogue, but to become a Jew. That's a different kind of calling. It's not a higher calling, it's a different calling. Okay? Fair enough? Okay, so where do we find the guidelines for how Gentiles are to be involved within this Messianic movement? If you want to find those guidelines, there's a wonderful chapter in a wonderful book called The Enduring Paradox. The chapter was written by the person sitting to my right. Modern Day God-Fearers is the title of that chapter. You get all the ins and outs of it in that chapter. But would you, since I've set the stage, quickly summarize for us and go all the way back to Acts 15 on it too. And the Acts 15.
Hang on. You continue talking here.
Okay. This was a decision. I was going to say this was a decision that was made by the early leaders of the early Messianic Jewish community in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 15 is where it occurred. Now, and their decision, which Patrice will reflect on, gave the guidelines for how do we. They were responding to a question. We're seeing more and more Gentiles who have accepted Yeshua as the Messiah, and they are now living. They want to connect with this Jewish community. How do they connect as non-Jews with this Jewish community? And so the decision was made, but many people are totally unaware of this interesting fact. The decision that occurs in Acts chapter 15 is identical to a decision that occurred probably some 50 to 70 years before, and it was a decision that was made by Hillel. Was it Hillel or Gamliel? As I'm thinking about it now. I think it was Hillel. And when asked that question, and of course it went back and forth between Shammai and Hillel, as those things tended to do. Hillel basically said, any Gentile could become associated with the Jewish community. Now, don't misunderstand Hillel or me. It doesn't say the Gentile became a Jew, but any Gentile who wanted to associate within the Jewish community fully, here's what was required for them to function within that Jewish community. And Hillel listed 4 things. And those 4 things happen to be the same ones that are listed in Acts 15. So this is a decision that was made by Acts 15, not because they were praying for God and the Spirit of God fell on them in a special way and they said, No, they already knew what that decision was. They debated that decision. They concluded the same decision that Hillel did. Now, is that enough for a context for?
No, because you did Acts 15, and what I'm going to talk about has almost nothing to do with Acts 15.
Okay, but that's where the decision.
That's where everybody points to.
Yes.
And they see the 4 things that were mentioned at that point.
Yes.
And they go, okay, it's pretty easy then for Gentiles to believe in Jesus.
And to be part of the larger community.
Except they're not following any of the 4 things. And those 4 things never come up in discussion, or they're not important. They don't know what the 4 things are.
Before you do, a quick aside, as soon as you said that, my mind flashed back to a scene in a German castle. Patrice and I were teaching Frankenstein.
Okay, I know the castle. I don't know what you're going to say.
Anyhow, so we were teaching, and the question, and the stage was set by the person who invited us there. I mean, so he raised this question, not maliciously, but somewhat mischievously, I would say. It had to do with Acts 15. What were these people required to do? And one of the things they were required to refrain from was to refrain from eating blood.
Yeah, that's one of the things that Gentiles who believed in Jesus and wanted to worship him, they couldn't eat blood. And we just had a short discussion last week after services about blood sausage. And no, that was when we ate dinner with the people from Michigan. Blood sausage and haggis and all those things that people want to eat now, and they enjoy them very much, except it says in Acts 15, don't eat things with blood.
Okay, so I was very gentle when I answered that question, but so as not to fan any flames, but certain people very quickly got the point that our friend Clark had set the stage for by asking this question. And one of the leaders popped up and said, does that mean we can't eat blood sausage? Which was, in my answer, I did not reference blood sausage because I was trying to be gentle.
No, we didn't.
But yes, we had, the response was, yes, that's correct.
That's correct. And he said,
but no one told us these things.
and we said, it's been an Acts 15 all this time.
But anyhow, that's the scene that flashed in my mind when Patrice was talking. So,
Yeah, that was memorable.
yeah.
All right, so I don't even know how I got started on this, but because I was asked to do a paper,
Yeah,
I think
so.
about God-fear. So little did I know, God-fear is such a nice name. So I'm going to really speed up. Starting about the beginning of the Roman Empire, there arose spontaneously, or actually they started being described. They may have been going on for years, we don't know. Interested Gentiles who would start attending synagogues around the Roman Empire. And they not only were they allowed in, they were welcomed in. And that might be different for some of you who've always had the impression that because Paul and Peter could not sit together and eat, then people around you have assumed that they couldn't talk to each other. There was nothing to do with Jews and Gentiles, which couldn't be further from the truth. That is absurd. Because we know from history that Gentiles were interested in Judaism. And they would show up at a synagogue and they would just come regularly. And if they were really interested in what they were hearing, because these are pagan people coming to a Jewish service. These are people who are non-religious at best, or who possibly worshiped other gods also. But if they came and sat and learned at the synagogue and wanted to learn more, there was special arrangements made. And so this was a normal thing at this time period in the Roman Empire, that in every major city, Gentiles, and there was a lot of women in this group that was interested in attending synagogues, because women tended to be, how can I put this nicely, less interested in making war and enemies and being macho. And so they were attracted by the high moral standards of the Jewish faith. And if they remained and became almost like a good buddy to the congregation and were recognized, people knew their names, they were there for years, they would be called by a certain name. They'd be called God-fearers. God-fearers. These are not normal Gentiles walking on the street. These are people who go to a synagogue and learn about the Jewish God and read the Jewish scriptures and listen to the teaching. And they would be, out of this group of God-fearers, the regular attenders, some of them would want to convert to Judaism. Trust me, this did not get them a better job. It did not help them to be a higher class citizen. This could only hurt their social chances and their job chances in the Roman Empire. And yet, this continued to happen. So these God-fearers, if they went the next step, they could become converts to Judaism and join the synagogue with full membership rights and opportunities and all that. We meet a God-fearer close up and personal in Acts 10, although he's almost never identified with that term, though that technical term does appear in the Newer Covenant. Okay, in Genesis 10, I'm sorry, in Acts 10, there was a man in Caesarea named Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian regiment. He was a devout man, that's a technical Jewish term, he's dati, and feared God. There's your term. He was a God-fearer. It's not just that he was afraid of God or he didn't want to get squashed by God, or he was a God-fearer. Along with, not just him, he wasn't wacky, his whole house. In the middle of Caesarea, which was a Roman-built city, built for Romans, is this centurion who had an Italian regiment. He could be in charge of 100 men or more. He was a God-fearer. Now, dear reader, if you are living in the book of living at that time, you were going, what? He wanted to be he liked Jews. He wanted to go be a Jew. What are they doing? And his whole household, well, they're just nuts. He's nuts. This would not help his career in the army. He did many charitable deeds for the Jewish people. Oh, by the way, that's one of the things that's pointed out as part of Judaism, that you do good deeds, charity work, and always prayed to God. What? He prayed to God? Really? At about 3 p.m. Well, why would we care about 3 p.m? Oh, that's one of the regular prayer times in the temple. It's the afternoon service. So during the afternoon service time at 3 o'clock, he would do his afternoon prayers just like Jewish people did. And while he was praying, he distinctly saw a vision, an angel of God who came and said to him, Cornelius. Looking intently at him, Cornelius became afraid and said, what is it, Lord? And the angel said to him, your prayers and your acts of charity have come up as a memorial offering before God. This word for memorial offering is the same word that's used for sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem. So the angel is saying what you're doing, which are Jewish acts, are being accepted by the Jewish God as if they were your sacrifice. But see, we just read over that because we don't know anything about God-fearers or who cares about them. And Cornelius, what a guy. Yeah, that what he was doing in many human minds would be wacky, wouldn't it? This is not where you expect to find adherence to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In the middle of Gentile city, capital city, I know we think of Jerusalem as the capital city, but Caesarea really was the Roman capital. That's where Pontius Pilate actually lived. He used to visit Jerusalem. He hated it there. He wanted to come back to Caesarea. And he's there. He's an Italian soldier, once again. And so the angel said, he says, now send men to Jaffa. I know here it's Jaffa, but it's Jaffa. And call for Simon, who is also named Peter. He's told to contact Shimon. He's lodging with somebody else named Shimon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea. Verse 7, when the angel who spoke to him had gone, he called 2 of his household slaves and a devout soldier. So a God-fearing soldier in his regiment. Is this blowing your mind yet? Would you have expected that Roman soldiers would actually seek out the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then do stuff that honored, Jewish stuff that honored him? I don't think many people would do that. Who was one of those who attended him. After explaining everything to him, he sent them to Jaffa. So Cornelius is a good example of a Gentile who is labeled a God-fearer, because he's not just nodding his head to nice stuff. He's doing a Jewish life, even though he doesn't have to, even though he thinks it probably does him no good whatsoever, but he wants to do it. And what the angel tells him is that's being accepted by God as a sacrifice. Sometimes we get the impression that the Gentiles in the book of Acts are just, wandering down the street one day, and then they're struck by God, who tells them, I am the true God, and you must believe me. That wasn't happening. That doesn't happen. People continue on in their ways. But we do know about this one group of Gentiles. They were interested. They wanted to know more. After they wanted to know more, they wanted to do more. And this is the kind of situation Cornelius found himself in. So cut to the chase. By the time you get to Acts 15, what that's really talking about is not just your average Joe Schmo walking down the street who thinks he wants to believe in the God of Israel. It's God-fearers. um, James, who's in charge of the Jerusalem Council, says they already are being taught in the synagogues that they attend. Well, who would that be? Not average Gentiles walking down the street. No, God-fearers. And he says if they continue in the congregations that they've been going to, where they've been learning Judaism and learning about the scriptures, then God bless them. And then they don't need to do anything else to believe in Yeshua as the Messiah. Has that been over-explaining that too?
No, in fact, I want to build on what you've said and also build on some of the stuff you have in Modern Day God-fearers, just to draw a little further point to the Acts 15 decision. The Acts 15 decision does not require the Gentiles to be God-fearers,
No, it doesn't.
but it does require them to be Noachides, because the 4 prescriptions that are mentioned in Acts 15 are derived directly from the covenant God made with Noah. Now, who was Noah? A Gentile. Who here has not descended from Noah?
I think we all,
Okay, so the stuff that God gave to Noah, and this was part of what the response to the question to this poor gentleman in Germany. The stuff that God gave to Noah, God gave to all people who were Noah's descendants, and that included the stuff that's mentioned in Acts 15. Jewish expositors, teachers, sages, prior to the time of Hillel, had looked at Genesis chapter 9, which is the covenant, the Noahide covenant passage, and derived from there 7 principles. 7 principles. If you were going to function in Israel in any sense other than occasionally passing through, the requirement in ancient Israel was that you at least follow these 7. If you wanted to go beyond and go all the way through to become a God-fearer, by the time of the Second Temple period, they were called God-fearers. A God-fearer was a person who lived and practiced and ate like a Jew, but hadn't converted to Judaism. But if you looked at them, you couldn't basically tell the difference. A Noahide was someone who just followed the 7 principles of Noah in Genesis chapter 9, which raises the very interesting question. If there were 7 principles in Genesis 9, why did Hillel and why did James only mention 4? The reason is the other 3 were already laws in the Roman Empire, and if you weren't living by those, you wouldn't be living because you'd be dead. So all they had to deal with was the stuff that wasn't already being dealt with, and Hillel answered appropriately. James and the crew there answered appropriately. So anybody who's at least a Noahide, all the way through to a God-fearer as a Gentile, was part of the early Messianic community. Now that very quickly got diluted down through the centuries, but that's how it was at first. Those who are part of a Messianic synagogue should be, although that we don't check at the door, should at least
do any sort of
should at least follow the
oversight.
Noahide stuff, but be committed to the Jewish thing that this particular Messianic Jewish synagogue is doing. If you decide in that context you want to become a God-fearer and to live in the fullest sense of a Jewish life, that's cool. If God calls you to become a Jew formally, then you can convert. If God hasn't called you, we will try to make sure you don't get through the conversion process. Any one of those people from within the Noachides all the way through to the God-fearers as well as the converts, at least in our synagogue, qualifies for leadership within the synagogue.
I can read the 4 things really quick there in Acts 15, verse 19. Therefore, this is James speaking, the brother of Yeshua. In my judgment, we should not cause difficulties for those who turn to God from among the Gentiles. Remember what he's saying, not those who turn to Yeshua from the Gentiles, but those who turn to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from the Gentiles. That's a whole step in and of itself. It's not just presto changeo, you're Gentile and now you're a Jew. Now you can believe in Yeshua. It's not an option here. But instead, we should write to them to abstain from meat polluted by idols. Don't eat meat that has been sacrificed to an idol. Has anybody done that lately? Okay, so we can check. From sexual immorality. We haven't had a checkup on that, but you know yourself. Remember that the Corinthian church had a problem with a man. He's going to marry his stepmother after dad dies. You've got to maintain the sexual mores that are described for you in Leviticus. Check. From eating anything that has been strangled. How would you know? Well, we don't strangle things that we eat in America. We drain their blood, and it's not exactly kosher, but it's so close to kosher that it's acceptable. Because remember, you shouldn't eat anything with blood in it. That's back with Noah. And also from blood. And the rabbis took this last one from blood by saying you cannot eat meat that you've cut off a living animal. And that is not a hypothetical. And that was confirmed by Dr. Strange, our professor, who was raised on a ranch in Texas. This would be in the 1930s. And he said, yes, he would take, if there was an especially juicy pig, you might cut one leg off and eat that leg, and then cut another leg off and eat that leg. And those of us in the class were going like this.
They would keep the meat fresh.
OMG. That's what the rabbis are talking about. Don't do that. Don't do it. Kill the animal. It's more humane. And then eat it, but not pigs. So those four things, if you went to a church nowadays, pick a church, any church, and say, are you abiding by those? They look at you like, you got to get out of here, you nut bar. Those are the four things that they wanted in Acts. But today, it's like they don't exist. It's not relevant. We don't have free from the law. Oh, we're so, it's so wonderful. We just don't have to think about that kind of stuff anymore. So.
Okay,
Yeah.
One further thing. When you look at the book of Acts historically, literally, and geographically, as the rabbi, Rav Shaul, moves from place to place to take this Yeshua message, he always shows up at the synagogue first. And then he always gets involved with Gentiles as well. Well, what Gentiles is he getting involved with? It's the Gentiles who've become part of the Jewish community, or the synagogue community in that particular locale. So that is who he's dealing with within the context of Acts. That's why the Acts 15 question came up. These are some of the people who've come to faith in Yeshua. They came to faith in Yeshua as Gentiles, but they were part of this larger connected community to the Jewish community. They were either Noachites all the way through to God-fearers, and again, some converts as well.
Let me just make a small statement about Rav Shaul and his habit to go to the synagogues first in whatever town he happened to find himself in. There's that very famous statement, I know because it's mentioned a lot in churches. Lo, I turn to the Gentiles, Rav Shaul says. I remember him. He was rejected. He was sort of abused at one place. He said, lo, I turn to the Gentiles. If you look in the next city he goes to, he goes immediately once again to the synagogue. So you can't use that as a cut-off point where he no longer goes to Jews. And yet it is used continually. Look at the text. He continues his normal way of doing things, which is to go to the Jew first. I think he mentions that phrase at least one part I know about. So don't be Don't be tricked into thinking, well, he cut off Jews and now he's just talking to Gentiles.
Acts 17:2, as his custom was, Rav Shaul went into the synagogue. It was in the previous chapter, in chapter 16, I can't find the exact text, where he said, well, we're going to turn to the Gentiles. And so what does he do in the very next city, as she said?
Goes right to the synagogue.
And says, and this was his custom.
I guess that cutoff wasn't such a cutoff after all.
Yeah. But in the context of what was described for you, if the Jewish leadership of any particular community, even segments within the Jewish community in any place he was going to, if he said to them, okay, you're not interested in this, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. So what did he do when he went to the Gentiles? He just sort of looked around the rest of the synagogue and said, okay, here are the Gentiles. Okay, fair enough. That's the historical, geographic, and literary context of Acts and what we're dealing with here. Now, that's a long story for that question.
I don't even remember. Don't even say the question.
Role of
because-
Gentiles.
Oh, the role of Gentiles.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
So,
within Messianic
within
congregations.
Messianic congregations, yes.
Well, you can see why certain Messianic congregations, they're a little touchy about Gentiles trying to be in charge. And I've said on a couple of occasions where people would ask me that, and that who are actually here. And I haven't said this in a long time from a visitor. And the visitor might ask me, how many of the people here tonight are Jews? And I'd look around for a minute myself and I go, we say there's about half and half. I said, can you tell me which half are Jewish and which half are Gentile? And they go, no. And I went, good. Good. That's the way we like it.
And that's the way it should be within a Messianic synagogue. Because if you're going to be part of a Messianic synagogue as a non-Jew, and I say this because this has happened repeatedly in Messianic congregations, and there was just another one that had another split recently because of this kind of thing. People who come in as well-meaning Gentile believers, and they now want to shape the Messianic synagogue in their image rather than be shaped by the synagogue into a more Jewish image. That has happened frequently, unfortunately, within the Messianic movement. That's why what Patrice just mentioned to you is so important. Looking around, it should be virtually indistinguishable as to who is a Jew and who is not a Jew within a Messianic synagogue.
And then ironically, they point to somebody and say, well, they're obviously Jewish, and they weren't Jewish at all. But I didn't say that. I go, oh, that's interesting. I'll tell them you said that.
Now, did that get to the aspects of what you were shooting for, Skylar?
He's been busy. He has yelled at him.
I think so. So to summarize kind of what you're saying is that rabbi is not a preferred term for a Gentile within a congregation.
Let's not use it.
But as far as the roles of elders and leadership, it's Jew and Gentile together.
Correct.
For us.
Yeah.
You'll get pushback with some congregations.
Sure. But as you interpret the biblical text, that would be the model to follow.
But the Gentiles would have to be God-fearers and not be people who are there to get you to do what they did at their church before. That's what we always try to avoid. Is there's always visitors, and there's some people who come in and go, this has been great. I've been here a couple of weeks, but you need to do this, and you haven't done that, and you have to do it. And usually those three things are not Jewish things. They're horrifically un-Jewish things. And therefore, they're not going to be happy in our congregation. They're just not going to be happy in our congregation because we're not doing what they think feeds their soul. And God bless you. Go where they feed your soul and they do those things because you can, in our county, you can find 14 different churches that do what you like to do. So.
Yeah. So we wanted to make sure we answered the question, but we answered it against the background of the reasons for that answer. Okay. Our time is virtually over. any other questions?
Any other shorter questions?
Or no, even longer ones, we'll just write them down
Yeah,
for the
we'll write
next
them down
time.
for
That's-
next time.
Yeah.
I think for next time, maybe, and I know you went over this in class, but I'd like to kind of go over it again, is how we take our devotion to Hashem and our congregation to the community. In terms of and influence maybe the political society to choose Hashem and Hashem's teachings. But yeah, because
Okay.
it's not supposed to be in, I don't know. Yeah. Like it's not in the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't mention God, just as in Esther, God isn't mentioned, but the basis of those tenets exist.
People will argue with you as to whether that's the case, both as constitutional experts and as theologians. So I warn you I will warn you about that from the outset, and historians as well, now that I'm thinking about it. I will respond very briefly to that, but feel free to write that out in a question for the next time.
Oops.
If I've understood you correctly, if I haven't, correct me. If I understood you correctly, we as followers of God have never been called to take over the world. We've been called to be guide, not even God, lights is the term that's used. Going back to the prophets, Yeshua does it as well. Lights within the world. So those are two, if you think about it, those are two different things. We're not called to take over or dominate the world. We're called to be lights in the world that indicate that there is a God that you can connect with on a relational basis. Is that fair enough? The reason I mention that, and I mentioned this in class Thursday night, far more fully, is there is a movement afoot. It's been around for a while. It goes back to the early 1900s in its modern form. That was at one time called Dominion Theology. And just so you remember this conversation for Thursday night. That has within its framework the understanding that Christians, it's not a very Jewish movement, by the way, but that Christians are supposed to take over their society and their world and to rule over it and to institute God's rules over the world. Yeah, I'm not saying that's what you were saying, but I'm saying the reason this becomes an important discussion is that movement for a while was around and then it sort of died, but it has resurfaced.
Oh boy, has it resurfaced.
And unfortunately, it has resurfaced fully in a form called Christian nationalism, which is a very dangerous movement and is a very anti-Jewish movement. So, but that's all I will say. But there's a reason for understanding that question more fully, the question that you raised. It's an important question. Okay? And hopefully that will not get us in trouble, but if it does, we get in trouble
We've been
frequently.
in trouble for much less than that, so.
All right. All right, no other questions?
When are we meeting next?
I was trying to
Yes.
think.
I think it's after high holidays, I believe.
I think you're correct. I think this is the only meeting in September, and so the next meeting will be,
Near
think-
the end of October.
I think it, since we usually meet the second and fourth Saturday, I think it's gonna be the fourth Saturday, which I think fortunately does not fall on Halloween weekend.
No.
I think it's the weekend before, I think it's the weekend before Halloween. So we won't deprive you of your Halloween shindigs
Getting out
and
my
shenanigans.
non-digital calendar.
I have a quick question. If
Hang
can
on,
you
let's
guys,
just verify
Could be
that.
the 20, could be this weekend,
Yeah,
the 22nd.
1, 2, 3, 4, yes, the
We think it's the
22nd.
22nd. of
Okay.
October.
Scott says he has a quick question. We'll find out how quick it is.
And I'm going to make it super quick. So
Yes,
this
no?
whole this conversation about God-fears, converts, and the Noahide covenant, I'm going to email you a couple of questions, and maybe we can hit that next time.
Okay. Not a
I
problem
think
at
that
all.
would be the easiest way to do this, and I promise it won't be a tome. It'll be just a few questions. So
That's fine.
Okay, now, since Scott has already informed us as to part of the topic the next time we get together, your homework,
Everybody's homework?
everybody's homework.
Okay, everybody's
And you've
homework.
got plenty of time because this is like what, 6 weeks down the road?
Yeah,
Is to read the chapter on modern day God-fearers in Enduring Paradox.
or you can order a copy, can you, from the office, I thought.
Yeah, you
Not
can do
anymore.
that. Yeah, you can still do that.
I got mine from Amazon.
Yeah,
You can do that and get
It'll be-
used, I'm sure there's used copies, really. Probably cost $2.
okay. Now, there was a preliminary discussion about the fact that we had fallen into the habit of no longer doing Havdalah as part of this get-together. Please inform us, both
If you
those
missed
who
that.
are here and those of you who have joined us either on YouTube or by way of WebEx. Please inform us if you'd like us to reinstitute that. We will do so if we actually do start our time together before the close of Shabbat. If Shabbat's already closed, we will assume,
It's
and
dark out.
we assume then that you have already had Havdalah. If in those circumstances, so please let us know your preference, and we'll be happy to reinstitute it if that's what your wishes are.
Stump the Stars, all one word, at gmail.com.
That's correct. Cool. Thank you much. Would you close in prayer?
I knew you were gonna ask me that.
Yes, of course.
I had a vision.
You had a vision. There was a flame from on high. No, I'm sorry.
Avinu Malchenu, our Father and our King, you are a great God, and it's a privilege to serve you. We thank you and praise you that you have given us your word. We thank you that we live in a place where we can study your word, we can ingest it, and we can ponder it. Help us as we continue to read and study to be able to see fruit in our lives as we step out and act in your name. Father, help us to reach out to those who need you desperately. Reach out to us who go through times when we really need you too. And we're going to remember that you are the most dependable thing in the universe, the most dependable person, spirit, whatever in the universe. Thank you for your strength. Thank you for never abandoning us. And give us a good holiday season, one in which you are honored. B'Shem Yeshua Meshachenu, in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
And she said strength as part of her prayer, which relates to discussion we had in the car on the way down that we ought to pick up for these people. And that
I looked
is,
it up.
yes, and that is, in fact, what does this Hebrew term strength mean and signify? Two different things. But we'll leave that for the next time.
Yes.
And hopefully we will remember.
Next
If not,
time.
you guys can
So-
remind us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Have a great week.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Knock
Good to
yourself
hear your
out.
Thank you
voice.
for joining
Jacob.
us.